Welcome to the pod Biomanufacturing and Fermentation Technology. In this episode, we translate microbial science, process engineering, and manufacturing realities into insights that scale.
Welcome to the debate. What if I told you that for a newly graduated PhD chemist, or say a molecular biologist, the most important factor for getting hired today isn't actually their ability to run a pristine mass spectrometer?
Right. It's their ability to make a sale, which honestly, it sounds like a joke, or at least a profound misunderstanding of what a scientist actually does.
It really does sound counterintuitive. If you're a bench scientist listening to this right now, you might be thinking, I didn't spend 8 years in grad school to become a pharmaceutical sales rep.
Yeah, no one wants to cold call from the lab.
Exactly. But the material we're analyzing today reveals a massive systemic shift in the biotech and chemical industries. We are operating in what the literature calls compressed innovation cycles.
Which basically means building the train tracks while the train is already accelerating.
That is exactly it. Laboratory bench work is now instantly coupled to product pipelines, regulatory milestones, and frankly, revenue timelines. So we're examining a deeply divisive question today.
Right, the big question. Do these new commercial skills, marketing, technical sales, business acumen, do they represent essential core enablers that empower a modern scientist?
And I argue that they absolutely do. I see them as vital leverage multipliers that give scientists crucial influence over R&D and provide real career resilience.
And I come at it from a very different perspective. I see this exact same shift as a structural risk, because emphasizing professional persuasion and revenue generation over deep disciplinary knowledge creates misaligned incentives.
You think it's a distraction?
A fundamental distraction, yeah. It distracts from the objective scientific inquiry that this entire industry is supposedly built on.
Well, let's start by laying out our baselines, because the reality of the industry has permanently changed. In modern life sciences and chemical sectors, technical excellence is no longer a differentiator. It's assumed.
Assumed?
Yeah. I mean, if you have a PhD, your ability to optimize a yield is taken as a given. The real differentiation now comes from your ability to connect those bench experiments to markets, to customers and to financial outcomes.
And marketing is such a loaded term for researchers.
It is, which is why I want to be precise here. When the material talks about marketing, it is not talking about superficial, sleazy selling.
It's definitely not about cold calling.
Right. It maps directly to essential scientific duties. We're talking about designing robust data packages for regulatory bodies like the FDA.
Sure, which is highly technical.
Extremely technical. We're talking about taking incredibly dense, complex technological architectures and translating them so that non-experts, investors, and KOLs, key opinion leaders, those top-tier researchers who influence the whole field, can actually understand the value proposition?
I agree that communication is vital, but the problem here isn't communication. It's the underlying mandate.
How so?
Well, the material we're analyzing points to a deeply concerning piece of empirical evidence. Surveys of chemical industry employers and recent graduates explicitly conclude that business and transferable skills are now often valued more highly than deep disciplinary knowledge at career entry.
You see that as a negative?
It is a massive red flag. Think about the implications of that shift. We are taking brilliant technical minds and demanding that they act as, and I'm quoting the text here, bridges between engineers and customers.
Which is a valuable role.
But when you expect a scientist to constantly balance their technical rigor with competitive positioning and, professional persuasion, you are shifting their core mandate. They're no longer primarily tasked with discovering the truth. They are being tasked with facilitating commerce.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Facilitating commerce and discovering truth are not mutually exclusive in an industrial context.
I mean, they often are.
Not inherently. In fact, technical sales is a very natural extension of scientific work. Consider the role of architect.
Okay, I like a good analogy. Lay it on me.
An architect can design the most structurally perfect, aesthetically brilliant building in the world. But if they don't understand client budgets, zoning laws, and supply chain logistics for the materials, that building will only ever exist on a blueprint.
Right.
It will never actually shelter a human being. The modern industrial scientist is the exact same.
They have to diagnose incredibly complex customer environments to co-design solutions.
And what kind of customers are we talking about here? Because they aren't selling consumer goods to the general public.
Exactly. They're dealing with a CDMO, a contract development and manufacturing organization. You know, the massive external facilities that actually scale up and manufacture a drug?
Or an OEM.
Right, an original equipment manufacturer that builds the million-dollar physical hardware for the labs. To make a technology viable for those massive players, you need deep product knowledge, yes, but you also need the commercial skills to make the science work in the real world.
That's a very elegant analogy. But wait, I have to stop you there, because the architect analogy completely sidesteps the structural tension inherent in this bridging function.
Does it?
I come at it from a different way. An architect's zoning laws are fixed, objective realities. You can't persuade a property line to move. But the material explicitly defines sales engineering and technical sales as requiring persuasion and relationship management.
Which is just navigating human dynamics.
It is way more than that. The text simultaneously demands the honest mapping of product capabilities and limitations to customer environments. So my question is, how honest can a scientist actually be when they are under the pressure of compressed revenue timelines?
Very honest, if they want to keep their clients.
But science requires absolute transparency about limitations, edge cases, statistical uncertainties. Persuasion, by its very definition, involves highlighting the benefits and minimizing the friction.
I think you're oversimplifying persuasion.
If a scientist is acting as this bridge, they are placed in an inherent conflict of interest. They're being asked to be an impartial judge of the data while simultaneously advocating for a sale.
But that conflict assumes the customer in a biotech or chemical context is naive. And they aren't.
They still want the best numbers.
Sure, but when a technical sales scientist is dealing with a pharma client, they're usually talking to other highly trained scientists. If you try to gloss over the statistical uncertainties or mask the limitations of a protein assay, you lose your credibility immediately.
You lose the sale.
You lose the trust, which loses the sale. The literature notes that top performers in these roles maintain their deep technical understanding. They read the exact same peer-reviewed literature as their clients.
I don't doubt their intelligence.
The persuasion we're talking about isn't deception. It's about structuring arguments around benefits, risks, and alternatives, rather than just dumping raw methods and results onto a PowerPoint slide and hoping the client figures it out.
But the very mechanism of structuring that argument, the persuasion itself, inherently alters what data gets prioritized. And that naturally brings us to how this external behavior affects the internal dynamics of research and development.
Which is a crucial part of the text.
Right. Because the external bridging with clients is one thing, but the material also discusses how these commercial skills are meant to increase a scientist's influence inside their own R&D organization.
Absolutely. And this is where the leverage multiplier effect becomes incredibly powerful. If a scientist possesses basic financial literacy, they earn a necessary seat at the decision-making table. Let's talk about TEA, or techno-economic analysis.
Right. Basically mapping out the actual cost of scaling a chemical process.
Exactly. It's understanding the margins and cost structures. If a scientist understands TEA outcomes, they don't just blindly chase a 99% yield in a vacuum.
We have to look at the price tags.
Right. They look at the data and realize, hey, this reaction gives us a 99% yield, but the catalyst costs $10,000 a gram. If we drop to a 92% yield using a significantly cheaper catalyst, we actually make this molecule commercially viable. They shape the experiment to match the economic reality.
And you view that as a positive influence on R&D?
It is essential. Instead of just accepting a roadmap handed down by executives with MBAs, a commercially aware scientist can argue for or against projects effectively.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
You're describing a scenario where the scientist uses business logic to defend the science. But if we look closely at the text, the reality is much more insidious.
Insidious is a strong word. How so?
The text notes that transitioning into these roles involves moving from running all experiments personally to, and I quote, selecting and shaping the experiments that matter most commercially. That is a fundamental shift in how we define success at the bench.
It's just prioritizing resources. You can't run every experiment.
It's filtering hypotheses through a commercial lens. Look, in purely objective research, you follow the data. If an experiment reveals an anomaly, you investigate the anomaly, because that is where paradigm-shifting breakthroughs actually come from. Penicillin was an anomaly.
Right, but
But if a scientist has internalized the cost of goods, the funding mechanisms, and the immediate competitive landscape, they will naturally begin to self-censor. They'll only select the experiments that have an obvious short-term value proposition.
you think they'll play it safe?
Absolutely. That means we stop funding deep, risky, foundational science, and we over-index on incremental, safe, commercially viable tweaks.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. You were talking about the ideals of academic basic research, but the reality of industrial science requires massive capital.
Of course it does.
We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars to bring a new molecule or a novel chemical process to market. If an industrial scientist ignores the commercial viability of an experiment, they aren't being noble. They are wasting resources that could be used to develop something that actually reaches the clinic.
But where's the line?
Well, the text points out that knowledge of finance, regulation, and intellectual property is increasingly seen as integral to being an effective industrial chemist, not some separate business function you can just outsource.
Right.
If you don't shape your early experiments around regulatory pathways and patent strategies, your discovery dies in the lab. It never helps a single patient.
I am not arguing against basic regulatory awareness. Obviously, you need to know if your compound is totally unpatentable. But there is a profound difference between understanding the regulatory path and internalizing the company's revenue targets to the point where it dictates your experimental design.
I don't think it dictates it. It informs it.
When talent analyses demand scientists who can contribute directly to a company's growth strategy, the scientist stops being a researcher. They become a product manager with a pipette.
Okay, let's pull on that thread, because we need to talk about the sheer volatility of this industry. That internal influence we just discussed, the ability to steer the R&D roadmap, it doesn't just protect the science. It protects the scientist.
Oh, we're talking about the career resilience argument now?
Yes, and it is staggering. In volatile fields, think about early-stage platform biotechs or, green tech chemical startups. Commercial skills are a major hedge against market and funding cycles.
Okay, fair point.
Let's paint a picture here. Imagine a Series B biotech startup. The funding climate cools, a clinical trial hits a snag, and the board decides to shut down the early discovery lab to conserve cash.
The scenario that happens all the time, sadly.
All the time. The bench scientist who only knows how to run a mass spectrometer might be out of work for months. But the commercially savvy scientist, the one who spent time collaborating on white papers, who joined customer calls as a subject matter expert, who understands how to diagnose customer pain points?
They have a parachute.
Exactly. They have options. They can pivot into product management, technical marketing, or business development.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the psychological toll of the environment you're pushing them into?
In what sense?
The material explicitly acknowledges the realities of quota pressure and corporate politics. Now, the text tries to brush this off. It claims that poorly set quotas and misaligned incentives are merely firm-specific issues that you can just vet out during a job search.
Right, you can choose a good company.
But anyone who has studied organizational behavior knows that is a remarkably naive defense.
You don't think structured sales targets can provide clarity for a scientist transitioning into business?
I think structured targets in sales are inherently divorced from scientific reality. A biological system does not care about a Q3 revenue target.
Well, obviously not.
A chemical reaction does not spontaneously optimize itself because the sales engineer is $50,000 short of their quarterly bonus. When you push scientists into technical sales, field application roles, or key account management, you are subjecting them to corporate pressures that run entirely counter to the rhythms of scientific discovery.
But that's a different rhythm altogether.
You're linking their livelihood, their mortgage, and their performance metrics directly to commercial adoption rather than scientific accuracy.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, mostly because it creates a false dichotomy between scientific accuracy and commercial adoption.
How is it a false dichotomy?
Because in the life sciences and chemical sectors, commercial adoption is fundamentally predicated on scientific accuracy.
Not always.
A CDMO will not adopt a new biomanufacturing process if the science is flawed. The data has to hold up to a rigorous audit. Furthermore, the material notes that many companies are actively running technical sales development programs to bridge the gap between traditional academic curricula and commercial needs.
To train them to sell.
To train them to solve problems. They're creating roles like field application scientists or solutions consultants precisely so the individual doesn't face the raw, unmitigated quota pressure of a generic software sales rep.
They're still selling.
They exist in a hybrid space where their scientific background is their primary asset. It gives them a durable edge in earning client trust.
A durable edge in earning trust in order to make a sale. Listen to the language the industry uses. Solutions engineering, technical marketing. These are just euphemisms for commercial persuasion.
I think that's a bit cynical.
And while I acknowledge that an individual scientist might find a very lucrative and comfortable career there, my concern is for the ecosystem as a whole.
Ah, the brain drain argument.
Exactly. If we signal to early career scientists that the fastest way to leadership, influence, and financial stability is to step away from the bench and into the boardroom, who is left to do the deep, uncompromising, unglamorous work of actual discovery?
The scientists who are empowered and funded by their commercially savvy colleagues? Look, no one is saying every single molecular biologist needs to become a field sales rep.
But the incentives are pushing them that way.
Well, the material is synthesizing a broader reality. Core skill domains like clear communication, understanding the downstream business unit, interpreting basic TEA outcomes, and relationship management are complementary to scientific expertise. They are not substitutes.
Well, the survey data we discussed earlier disagrees with you. Employers value those business skills more highly at career entry. That structurally makes them a substitute in the hiring process.
I argue it makes them a differentiator because, like I noted at the very beginning, the technical baseline is already met by the mere possession of the degree. Let me summarize my position because I think the mechanics of this shift are overwhelmingly clear.
Let's hear it.
Marketing and technical sales skills do not require abandoning the scientific method. Instead, they're the very tools that ensure scientific expertise actually survives the compressed innovation cycle.
Survives. But in what form?
In a form that impacts the world, by mastering regulatory awareness, intellectual property strategy, and customer pain points, scientists ensure their work escapes the vacuum of the laboratory and reaches the market. These skills are leverage multipliers. They allow researchers to protect their roadmaps, communicate their value, and build resilient, high-impact careers in an industry that is famously unforgiving.
And my position remains that this shift, while perhaps economically rational for a company, represents a profound structural risk to science itself. I concede that a basic understanding of the business landscape is pragmatic for any professional today.
Good. We agree on that.
However, elevating commercial skills, relationship management, and persuasion to the level of, or even above, deep disciplinary knowledge is incredibly dangerous.
Because it changes the incentive structure.
Exactly. Maintaining true scientific credibility requires a necessary degree of separation from quota pressures, revenue timelines, and purely commercial experiment selection. When the laboratory becomes indistinguishable from the marketplace, when the hypotheses are generated by the sales pipeline, we risk losing the objective rigor that makes the science valuable in the first place.
The tension between the pursuit of pure knowledge and the heavy demands of the market is as old as industry itself. But looking at the text today, the stakes in biotech and chemicals have perhaps never been higher.
Precisely. It challenges us to look closely at the source material and ask a very difficult question. Where should the line between scientific integrity and commercial necessity actually be drawn?
And that is a question we will leave in your hands. We invite you to examine the material, consider the changing realities of the industry, and decide for yourself. Are we simply giving the architect the necessary tools to build, or are we fundamentally changing what it means to operate within the laboratory? Thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to Biomanufacturing and Fermentation Technology with Prasad Urnala. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, Keep engineering biology into reliable manufacturing.